There is a question I have never once spoken out loud in 53 years of marriage. Not to my wife, not to my brother, not to any man I ever called a friend. I am 80 years old, and I am going to say it now for the first time because I think some of you already know exactly what I mean. My name is George, and I have loved my wife completely and honestly for my entire adult life, and I have never been fully certain she was the one I was supposed to choose. I want you to understand what I am not saying. I am not saying my marriage was a mistake. I am not saying I was unhappy or that I stayed out of obligation or that there was something broken between us that we kept hidden behind closed doors. Margaret was a good woman. She was patient in ways I never deserved. She raised our children with the steadiness I could not have matched alone, and she laughed at my jokes long after they stopped being funny, which is either the definition of love or the definition of sainthood, and I was never quite sure which. What I am saying is something quieter than that, and in some ways much harder to explain. When I was 24 years old, I met a woman named Claire at a conference I almost didn't attend. My supervisor had asked me to go in his place last minute on a Thursday afternoon, and I nearly said no. I almost said no. I have thought about that moment more times than I can count. The moment I almost stayed home, because if I had, none of the rest of what I'm about to tell you would have happened, and my life would have unfolded in the clean, untroubled way I had always assumed it would. Claire was from a small town in Vermont. She was there representing a nonprofit she had helped found, something to do with rural literacy programs, and she spoke about it with a kind of quiet conviction that I had never seen in anyone before. Not passion exactly. It wasn't loud. It wasn't performed. It was something more like certainty, like a person who had found the exact center of themselves and was simply living from that place. I remember sitting 2 rows behind her during the presentation and watching the back of her head and thinking, with a strange calm that I didn't fully understand at the time, I think I could spend my life talking to this person. We spoke for 3 days, meals, hallway conversations, one long walk through a city neither of us knew very well. We talked the way you only talk with someone who somehow already makes sense to you, where the conversation never requires effort, where you finish a thought and the other person doesn't just understand it, but adds something to it that you didn't know you meant. I had never spoken to anyone like that before. I would not speak to anyone like that again. On the last evening, we sat outside a small restaurant for almost 2 hours after the meal was finished, and neither of us moved to leave. And I remember the exact quality of the silence that settled between us eventually. Not uncomfortable, not charged, just very full, like something was sitting in the air between us, waiting to be acknowledged. I was engaged to Margaret at the time. Claire knew that. I had mentioned it on the first day, naturally, the way you mention something factual about your life. She never pushed. She never suggested anything. She was, in that way, as in every other way I observed in those 3 days, decent and careful and good. We exchanged addresses. This was 1967. There were no other ways, and we wrote to each other for about 4 months after that. Careful letters, friendly letters, the kind of letters that stay just on the correct side of the line without ever quite pretending the line isn't there. And then Margaret and I set the wedding date, and I wrote Claire one last letter telling her, and she wrote back with genuine warmth and wished us well, and that was the end of it. I never saw her again. I don't know what her life became. I don't know if she is still living. For a long time, I told myself that was fine, that it was the right and clean way for it to end, and I believe that was true. But I have carried her quietly, the way you carry something small in a coat pocket for 53 years, not obsessively, I want to be precise about that. I did not spend my marriage pining or distracted or secretly miserable. I was present. I was faithful in every sense of the word. I loved Margaret, and that love was not a consolation prize. It was not a settling. It was not a performance. It was real, and it was earned, and it grew over decades into something I am genuinely grateful for. We built a life together that I would not trade away. Our children are good people. We had long dinners and quiet Sunday mornings and years of small, ordinary happiness that I do not take lightly because I am old enough now to know that small, ordinary happiness is not a small thing at all. But there were moments. There were certain quiet evenings when the house was settled and Margaret was asleep and I was sitting alone. And something, a piece of music or a particular quality of autumn light or nothing at all, would open a door briefly in the back of my mind, and Claire would be there, not as a longing exactly, but as a question, as the same question, the one I never answered and could not answer, and perhaps was never supposed to answer, whether the life I chose was the life I was meant for, or simply the life I was brave enough to step into when the moment came. I have tried over the years to understand what that question actually means, whether it is about Claire specifically or whether Claire was simply the form the question took, the specific face that an unanswerable thing wore so that I could almost see it. I think now that it was the latter. I think what I was really carrying was not a regret about a specific person, but a recognition that choosing one life means not choosing another, and that the other life is not erased by that choice. It continues somewhere, in some form, as a road that is still there, even though you turned off it 40 years ago. The road doesn't disappear just because you stop walking on it. Margaret died 4 years ago. She was ill for a long time before that, and I cared for her. And the last years were hard in the way that caring for someone you love through their declining is always hard. Not tragic, not unbearable, just slow and intimate and demanding in a way that quietly becomes the whole shape of your life. And in those years, I will tell you something honestly. The question went quiet, not because it was resolved, but because there was no room for it. Because caring for her was so fully present and so completely real that there was simply nothing left over for wondering about other roads or other lives. And in some strange way I have thought about since, that felt like an answer of its own. Not the answer to whether I chose correctly, but an answer to what the choosing had made me. What 50 years with one person honestly lived had done to the inside of a man. I sat at her graveside on a cold November morning, and I thought, I do not know if I was always meant for you, but I was entirely yours. And I think those two things can both be true, and I think perhaps they have to be. I'm not sharing this because I think I made a mistake. I am sharing it because I have lived long enough to know that most people are walking around with the question they have never said aloud, and the weight of keeping it unsaid can, over a long time, become something you stop even noticing because it has simply become part of the way you breathe. And I wanted to say from where I am now that the question does not mean the life was wrong. It means you were paying attention. It means you understood somewhere beneath everything that the life you were living was one of many possible lives, and that choosing it was a real act, not an automatic one. That you showed up for it, that it cost you something and you paid. I am 80 years old. I have one answer and one question, and I have made my peace mostly with the fact that they will both go with me when I go. That is not a tragedy. That is just what a life is. You feel it as honestly as you can, with the people in front of you, with the choices you actually make rather than the ones you imagine. And at the end, if you were paying attention, you find that what you built was real, even if it was never quite complete. Nothing is ever quite complete. I think that might be the whole point.